All right, let's get rolling. So this is our second installment of getting started with Mapbox GL JS. I am Chris Wong, Senior Developer Evangelist at Mapbox, here to get us started. You're already familiar with Mapbox, but we do a lot more than just maps. So go check out our website and you can see our search products, our navigation products, and we actually have data products as well. So you already know me if you've seen the last video. If you're just dropping in, I'm Senior Developer Evangelist. I've also been a civic hacker. I'm a web mapping educator, a urbanist and CityFile, and in the past have been a solutions architect, solutions engineer, various other jobs, but happy to be a developer evangelist today. So here's what we're going to cover in this session. So we're going to add local GeoJSON data to a map. We're going to pick up where we left off in the first episode. We're going to understand sources and layers in Mapbox GL JS maps. We're going to add data-dependent styling. We're going to get features on hover with query rendered features. So again, just going to go very slow and kind of walk through each one of these steps. But in the last episode, we added some markers to the map. We got the basic map working. Here we're going to add some of our own data, and then you'll be on your way to doing more advanced things with Mapbox GL. So we'll come back to that slide in a second. Let me stop sharing, or let me start. Sorry, let me bring up my project from last week. So I have this first map project that we were looking at before, and I'm going to drag it into Visual Studio Code. And if you recall, we had some JavaScript in here. So here's my markers. Here's where I instantiate the map. So the next thing we're going to do is add some GeoJSON data. And what we've got here is, so probably the best way I always use to describe what GeoJSON data is to go to geojson.io. This is the site that I've actually been spending a good bit of time improving lately. And it's hosted by Mapbox, but it's a wonderful way to actually create new GeoJSON data by drawing it on the map. And then you can actually see what the data looks like on the right side in this panel here. So I find this to be a very useful way to teach. But for example, if we just want to make a marker, I can draw a point. And let's move. I'm going to go over to New York and drop a pin. So I'll just click here. So I'm just going to click right on the label for New York. And on the right side, you see this data. And this is GeoJSON data. So GeoJSON is just a structured way or a schema for describing spatial geometries and their associated properties using JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, which is how we store data and move data around in a JavaScript environment. So you can see that this is a feature collection. So each feature, what I've selected right now is a feature, includes properties. So this is empty. There's no properties associated with this feature, but there is a geometry associated with the feature. And the geometry is a point geometry, which is what type point means. And then all we need to describe a point, as we covered in the last session, is longitude and latitude coordinates. So that's what a point looks like. But of course, we also need lines sometimes. So we can draw a line on here, and you'll see what a line string looks like. So you'll see instead of one set of coordinates, we have an array, and inside that array is 4 coordinates. And that describes my line, and the type is line string. And then last but not least, we can actually do a polygon. And yes, that'll get us, so that's a quadrangle or 4-sided shape that I made down here, and that's of type polygon. So I can actually export all of this as a feature collection, and I could bring this right into a web map. Obviously, this is actually a Mapbox GL web map that these are already on. So under the hood in geojson.io, we're actually rendering all these things on the map. But that's what we're going to cover today and show you how to actually take GeoJSON data like this and bring it into a map. So I don't want to use this dummy data that I created that doesn't have any real meaning. So what I'm going to do for this demonstration is go grab some GeoJSON data from the internet. And before I do that, let's go take a quick look at this slide on styles. So when we say style in Mapbox GL terminology, we're actually referring to not just the rendered part of the map, but the data behind it as well. So all of it comes together into this basically style JSON structure. You don't really need to get that involved with with building these out because most of the time it's happening behind the scenes. But what you should know is that sources and layers are something that you can actually add after the fact. So as I covered last week, when you're loading a Mapbox // URL to get the base map or the base style or the core style, whichever way you want to refer to it, it actually is grabbing this, a version of this that includes all the information needed to display that map. But what's most important for you right now is to understand the concept of a source and a layer. And sources are basically the data that gets rendered on the map. And today we're going to deal with GeoJSON sources, but there's also something called vector tile sources, which are what is rendering the map that we're already seeing. And then layers are where they actually get where data sources actually get styled. All right, so you can actually have multiple layers that depend on the same source, but all of this together makes the style. So if we take, for example, this map that we've already made, I'm going to click go live here so we can actually check out the map again. So this is our map from last week. Oh, and I think there was one little change we wanted to make here because we looped over these markers, and yes, we wanted to just use the color value. So I had 5 colors here for the 5 boroughs of New York. I have a little pop-up here for each one that shows the name of the borough. So very simple, but when we load this map, we're actually going to Mapbox to get the style definition, and then it's also serving up vector tiles behind the scenes that are, showing us all of the coastlines and all of these, boundaries and labels and things like that. So all that comes in. So the task now is to actually, once this style is loaded, we already have a functional map and a working style. We actually want to add a new source and layer to that style with our own data. So that's what we're going to do next. So very quickly, I'm going to go search for let's see, borough boundaries. And the New York City Open Data Portal should be able to help us out here. Let's click on this data set. So here is some spatial data with the borough boundaries for New York City. And if I click on the export tab here, there's actually a GeoJSON export. So I can export it directly in GeoJSON format. If I didn't have it, if I had a shapefile, for example, I could open it in QGIS and transform it into GeoJSON or export it as GeoJSON. So it all depends on where you're getting your data from. Maybe you already have spatial data ready to go. So I'm going to download borough boundaries. And let's take a quick look. So I'm going to drag it into Visual Studio Code. And obviously, this is a lot more complex than the example we looked at on geojson.io, but you see the same bits are in here. So we've got properties, and then inside the properties, we actually have some key value pairs. So there's a borough code, there's a borough name. So these would be, if you're familiar with shapefiles, these would be like your attributes. And then we have lots of coordinates to make these more complex shapes. Actually, you know what, for fun, let's drag this into, let's clear this in geojson.io and let's drag it in. Let's see what it looks like in here. Hey, beautiful. Actually, this is good because I think what I would like to do here is add some additional properties because you can see the properties that we got here are not terribly useful. And they just have the area and length and then the name. Actually, the name is kind of useful, but what I might want to do is come back in here later and add like something like the census population for each one of these so that we can have a little more realistic data in the map. So I'll do that in a moment after we're done actually adding this. So the first thing I want to do, if I come back to my project, is I'm going to make a new folder called data, just to keep things a little organized in here. And then I actually want to move this GeoJSON file into the data folder. So it's just kind of stored locally as part of my project. So let's reveal in Finder. Let's copy this GeoJSON file into the data folder. And I'm going to give it a little more web-friendly name. So let's rename it. Instead of capital B, it'll just be lowercase b. And instead of a space, we'll do a hyphen and we'll call it boroughboundaries.geojson. Okay, let's go back to my code. And I'm going to try and set this up a little bit more nicely so you can actually see. So let's zoom in a little bit so that's bigger, and let's show the map over here so you can actually see what's going on. Okay, so we've got our map and we're ready to add this GeoJSON data to it. So like I said, we have sources and layers, and let's go take a look at the docs and see if we can find a good example. So we're going to go to the API reference for Mapbox GL JS, and we're going to go down to sources. And we have lots of different sources. So this is basically where data can come from that we want to render on the map. GeoJSON source is the one we're most interested in. And here's some great sample code that we can see. So there's a method called map.addSource. And all we do here is give that source a name, and that's what this string would be. We give it a type, which is GeoJSON, and then we tell it where the data is. So this data property, we can actually pass in a URL, or if we actually had the data locally as a variable in JavaScript in our environment already, we could pass that in as well. So right now we're just going to do a relative path to where this data is stored in our project. So what I want to do is actually do it down here in this map.onload callback. And that means that it will not run until the map's original style, like the core style or the base style, has loaded. So let's see. We're going to say add a source and layer for the borough boundaries for the NYC borough boundaries. Okay, so first thing we want to do is we'll say map.add source. So I'm just doing the exact same thing that's in this example. We want to give it an ID, so we can call it whatever we want. So I will call it, I'll just call it borough boundaries, so it will match the data file. Okay, second argument is an object. So we need a type, and that type will be GeoJSON, all lowercase. And then the data tells it where to go to get the data. So we're going to just say, go to the data directory and load borough boundaries.geojson, which is what we named this file. So first thing I'll do before I add a layer, remember right now there's no layer associated with this source, so nothing will show up on the map, but I will sanity check this, and if I've done this improperly and it can't fetch this file, it'll actually show an error in the console. So I just want to sanity check it. So let's open the console down here, and I see no errors. And just to show you what would happen if I misname this file, like if I called it boundaries with a Z, and I reload, we get a little 404. It says, I looked for this file and I couldn't find it. So change it back to the right file name. No errors means we're good to go, and we can actually get moving, adding the layer. Okay, so that means our source is now in the map. The map has downloaded this data. It's like ready to go in the background, but it is not actually being rendered or displayed until we say map.add layer. Okay, so let's take a quick look. We'll go back to the docs here, and we'll go to the API reference, and I'm going to show you what the add layer. Let's go down to add layer. So this add layer method adds a Mapbox style layer to the map style. So let's scroll down. There's lots of options, but here's a good example that we can take a look at. So it needs an ID. It needs a source. So in this case, they're actually defining the source at this, as the value for this key and value. But instead of doing it that way, we can actually reference the source which we added before. It also needs a type, so there's lots of different types of layers. So for polygons, most of the time we're going to start with a fill layer, and then I'll show you what we can do afterwards to make a line layer, so to make like an outline of it. So let's start with the fill layer. And then there's paint and layout properties, and these are how you really get into the nitty-gritty of styling. So we'll start with something really basic, but so let's make a new object to pass in to add layer. So we need a layer ID. So a good pattern here is to call it the source name. So I'll say borough boundaries dash fill, which is basically the source name and the layer type, and that can make a good unique ID. Of course, you can name it whatever you want. So let's give it a type. So this will be a fill layer. You can also do circle layers. You can do line layers. I'm missing a comma here. So we have type fill, and we need to tell it where to get the data from. So source. So like I said, this is the ID that we've created for this source, and we can just reference the same ID. So as long as this text matches this text, they're kind of linked together, and it knows where to grab them. So this should be working now. And if we reload our map, we have the default styling because we didn't tell it, to make it any particular color or opacity or anything like that. So it just shows up as black polygons. So you can barely make these out. So just for the heck of it, let's add a paint object here. And there's plenty to read up on, lots and lots of different options you can pass in, or values you can put into the paint object. But the very simplest ones are things like fill color. And you can use any HTML friendly color name or a hex code. So I'll just say orange for now. And if I hit save, you will see that now this entire GeoJSON data set is being filled with the color orange. This isn't terribly helpful. Maybe it is if that's what you want it to be, if this was like your background map. But you probably want to do data-driven styling, which is what we're going to move on to next. So before we move on to data-driven styling, let's go a little further here and actually do another layer. So I just want to illustrate the concept that two layers can use the same source. So I'm going to copy, add layer, and let's do a line instead of a fill. So the ID for this layer will be borough boundaries line. It will be of type line, and we can't use fill color on a line layer. So this is actually line color, and let's make it white. So I'll save that, and you'll see now we have a nice white outline. So we actually have multiple, it looks like just one polygon layer here, but there's actually two layers on the map, one to draw the white line and one to draw the orange fill. I can also do things like line, let's do line width. I think I can just pass a number to that. So now it's a much thicker line. So you get the idea, but you should definitely go check out the style specification and see what your different options are there. And when you come across lots of different examples, you'll find different ways that people style these things. We can also do, for example, line opacity. And we can make that like 0.7. And that'll make it slightly transparent. Depends on what you're going for. I don't think this is necessarily helpful, but just trying to demonstrate what you can do here. Okay, wonderful. So next we want to move on to some data-driven styling. So for this example, just want to use the borough code. So I have in my data, I have, if you recall, in the properties for each one of these GeoJSON polygons, there's a borough code, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 for the different boroughs of New York City. So we can actually use that data to style them different colors. And to do that, sorry, let's close this. Let's go back to our JavaScript. Instead of hard coding a fill color like this, we use what's called an expression. So I'm just going to type it out here, and then we'll talk through it. So we want to do a match expression. So we're not actually, because we're using, the borough codes are actually not numbers in our data; they're strings, and they're not something we could add or subtract, or there's really no value in incrementally moving between them. They're really just categories. So what we're trying to do is a categorical color coding here. So we'll say match. Then we have an array that says get, and then the name of the property from the GeoJSON data that we want to grab. So that would be borough underscore code. And then after that, we actually have key sequential keys and values. So basically the value from the data that we want to color, and then the color we want that value to be. So for example, if we had borough code 1, we can say green. And if we had borough code 2, we can say purple. And then the very last argument, or the very last item in this array, sorry, will be the default color. So I like steel blue, my favorite HTML color. And we'll see what that looks like. So I've only done boroughs 1 and 2, which should get us New York, Manhattan and the Bronx, actually. Should get colors. And then the other 3 are using the default color, which is steel blue, because I didn't define them. So that's what it looks like. And you can see how we now use this expression for fill color, and instead of hard coding that color, it's going to follow the rules set out in this language to determine what gets what color. So we did borough code 1 and 2, And let's go a little further and do 3, 4, and 5. So we'll change these really quickly. 3, 4, 5, and let's do orange, yellow, and pink. How about that? All right. So here's our beautifully colored categorical data-driven styling for the 5 boroughs of New York, along with 5 other colors that I used for the markers last week. But we're making progress, so this is great. Okay, so that is our styles. I wanted to show you one more thing. If you notice that, so we can get back in, if we can cover the concept of styles and layers a little bit more. What I want to show you here is that if we call map.getStyle down here in the, let's make this a little bigger for you. If we call map.getStyle in the console, remember map is a global variable on this page, so I can actually call getStyle on it, and it'll return the current style on the map. And this is what it looks like, and we can actually inspect it in here, which is great. But if you recall from the slide I showed earlier, we've got layers and sources, and remember there's a lot of sources that actually generate the base map and the labels and the land masses and that sort of thing. But what we did with add source and add layer is just add right on top of them. So if you look inside of sources, you'll see this source called composite is what we actually got back from Mapbox's servers, and that's what's powering most of the map. And then we have this source called borough boundaries, which is the one we just added right now in our code after the fact. And all it's doing is just putting them together into the same map. Same thing for layers. And this was actually really fun because if you inspect the layers, you'll see that there's already 85 layers on this map. And you're like, how can there be 85? I only added 1 or 2 for these polygons, but it starts at land. So this is actually the bottom layer, and they go in order. And you can actually see all the way up to the top layers, which will be the ones that we just added. So let's go all the way to the end of this list, and you'll see borough boundaries fill and borough boundaries line, which we just added on top. So another really cool thing you can do when you're adding layers in JavaScript is to add them below the labels. So right now, like, you can't see the word New York here because we added the borough boundaries on top of the layers. So what you can actually do is just pass in, when you do add layer, the layer name or the layer ID that you want your layer to be placed underneath. So I see a whole bunch of, so I see boundary layers here. These are like showing the boundaries between, between like states and counties and things like that. And then I start seeing all these labels. So naturally the labels are probably on top. So layer 82 all the way back to layer 71 is labels. So this looks like our lowest label layer. And what I can do, let's see if I get this right. We'll say add layer. And I think if we just pass in a second argument, which is the ID of the layer we want to put this layer underneath, this should make it show up underneath that road label layer. And look at that. Okay, so this might not be the most attractive way to do this because we actually are getting labels for neighborhoods, but we're not really seeing the streets. So you might want to bring the streets on top. It all depends on what you're going for. I just want to illustrate the concept that we can, we can slide layers in to the stack of layers kind of wherever we need them to be. And you can also move them around later if you want to. So that's fun. And now we have labels on top of our geoJSON data. Okay, wonderful. So next thing I wanted to do, and let's see. So I want to actually get data back out of this map. So this is where, with web mapping, you probably want to add interactivity, and we're going to get into a lot of that next week. But the most basic thing we can do is, say if the user clicks on this map, can we just figure out what they clicked on, right? So we actually have, we know which polygons or which boroughs each one of these 5 polygons is. But can we, when the user actually clicks on it, can we actually derive, which polygon they clicked in and then do something with that information? So for example, the pop-ups are one thing, but like you could actually have if I hover over this borough or this polygon and I click on it, we can take data from that geoJSON data and use it elsewhere in our app. So we could go fetch data from a database with it. we could just display it on the screen in like its own little kind of modal window or something like that. So to do that, we're going to use something called query rendered features. Before I go into query rendered features, I want to add a little bit more data to this data set, like I was saying before. So remember, I have it open here in geojson IO, and I want to add population to it. So let's just do some data editing here. So a lot of times when you make web maps, you're going to have to do, you have to prep your data and add columns that don't exist in the source data and things like that. So I'm going to say borough population NYC, and I'm just going to hard code. Hey, that map looks not too different from my map. That's funny. Let's go see if we can get these borough populations. So let's say 2020 population for each one of these boroughs is like this. So I'm going to copy and paste these and build out the properties in my GeoJSON data. So I'll start with Manhattan. And remember, this has commas in it, so I want to turn them into numbers. But let's click on Manhattan here, and let's add a row, and we will say pop 2020. So I'm going to call this field pop 2020, and let's save that as a number. See if it worked. So let's see. Well, I don't need to scroll down here, but let's just do it on all the different boroughs. So let's go to Bronx, and we'll say pop 2020. Whoops. Pop 2020. So there's our population for 2020 for the Bronx. Is that right? Yes. Okay, so we'll save that. Let's click on Queens. 2,405,000. So let's add row. Pop 2020. We'll paste that in there. Okay, 2 more to go. Bear with me. And Staten Island. And it looks like it's trying to draw a polygon, and I'm not sure why I did that. Okay, last one. Let's do Brooklyn. So Brooklyn. Up 2020. And let's get rid of the commas and hit save. Okay, there's also a table view in GeoJSON IO, so I can make sure that this pop 2020 field has a value for all 5 boroughs, and we're good to go. So I could download this file as GeoJSON, or I can just copy it and overwrite the file in my project. So I'm just going to do that. Let's delete this, paste it in. And I'm just going to sanity check this a little bit and make sure I see the pop 2020 is in there. So I'll save that, and we should be in good shape. So all I'm doing is just adding another property to this GeoJSON data, and you can add as many properties as you need to here for whatever you're trying to render on your map. But now we're ready to actually do query rendered features. So let's go back to the API reference, and let's go find query rendered features. Okay, so returns an array of GeoJSON feature objects representing visible features that satisfy the query parameters. So basically what we can do here is when the user clicks on the map, we can query rendered features. So these examples are just saying query rendered features at this location, this X and Y location on the map. So how do we know what the X and Y location is? We probably want to get that from a click. So let's see if I can find a good example of that. Let's see, Mapbox GL query rendered features on click. There's probably an example for this. Yes, select features around a click point. So I think if we click on here, you'll see in this example, oh, this is actually selecting features, but let's go down and take a look at the example and see if we can find it. Okay, so we don't need all of this, but this will be a good way to get us started. So this is just a good example of a click event listener. So we can just say map.onClick, and then we'll pass in a function. So let's say map.on and click, and then we'll pass in an arrow function here. And I'm just going to say console.log click, and we'll sanity check that first. So I'm wondering why my styles aren't working anymore. And did I change borough code to numbers? Of course I did. Okay, so when I copied this out of geoJSON IO, borough code, the borough codes are now numbers instead of strings. So let me just fix that really quickly, but let's get rid of these quotes. And now it will be checking for the number 3 instead of the string 3, etc. Let's get our colors back. There we go. Beautiful. Okay. So console log click. So anywhere I click on the map, you'll see that it's showing up in the console with this just message click. But if we go back and take a look at this example, if we use the E object inside this callback, we can actually get E.point, and that will actually give us the X and Y coordinates inside the map container where we clicked. So instead of just saying click, I want to say console log click E.point. And again, we're going to sanity check this and see what kind of information we're getting back. So click, this is 419.241. If we do it up here in the corner, it should be closer to 0. So that's 814. And then down the bottom right, 1063, and Y is 486. So you get the idea here, but now we're getting the X and Y coordinate inside the container. Now we want to say, hey, map, given this X and Y coordinate, what is underneath it? So we want to query rendered features. So let's go back to that example. And see, what they're doing here is they're actually querying rendered features on a bounding box. I don't think we want to do that. I think we want to do it just on a point. So I think we can just pass in E.point, and let's see what we get back. So here, let's do a variable const features equals. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you. Query rendered features, E.point. So this is telling us where in the map container we want to query features, and then we pass in an object. Let's clean this up a little bit. And we want to tell it which layers we're actually interested in. So remember, there are already 80 some layers on the map that came from Mapbox and make the base map. We don't really care about those. We care about just the layers that we added. And if you recall, there's a line layer. We're not really clicking on the lines because they're very small. We're actually clicking on the fill. So this is the ID of the layer that we care about. So we'll pass that in. You can actually pass in multiple layers and you'll get back, any features under the mouse pointer that fit into these layers. So right now we're just passing an array of a single layer, and that's fine. Let's say console.log features. And when we click, it should be querying rendered features on this particular layer, borough boundaries fill, and it should give us back an array of features. So, and then we're going to log that in the console, and let's see what happens. So if I click out here, I'm getting a console log for click, but I don't think that we have any features. Actually, hold on, that's not working. Let's get rid of that. Map.query rendered features, E.point. Okay. Beautiful. Okay, so if I click outside of my polygons, like over here in New Jersey, I get an empty array back. And if I click on the polygons, there's only one feature because they don't overlap. So there's only one that can be in view. If I inspect this, you'll see the 0th item in my array here. It gives me back the data. So I actually have properties, and I can say borough code 1 pop 2020 is this value. So I can actually now I have this in hand, and I can actually do something useful with it. So what I can do here is I can let's see. Let's make another variable here. Let's say selected borough equals features 0. Actually, that's probably not the best way to do it. Let's unpack features, and we'll just call it selected borough. So this notation, if you're not familiar with it, will just get us back the first borough. And if it's undefined, so we'll say if selected borough. That'll handle when they click out. If the user clicks outside of this layer, then we'll get nothing back, and then we should do nothing. So we should only do something if it exists. And for now, I'm just going to do an alert. and we'll say selected borough dot properties dot pop 2020. So we're pulling data that we got back from query rendered features out, and then we can do something else with it. So let's see if that works. Right. So this is not a terribly helpful way to display this. So let's actually make that into a string. And we'll say the population of, and let's put in the borough name, is. And while I have you guys, feel free to ask questions in the chat. We're going to have time for Q&A at the end, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. But if you have any in the meantime while I'm presenting, go ahead and put them in the chat. Okay, so we're building out this string template, and yeah, now we need the borough name. Let's go back to our data and make sure we get the property name correct. So when we query rendered features, we're going to get all these properties back. We can grab as many as we want. So I'm going to say selected borough.properties.borough name. Okay, and just to make this a little easier to read, let's unpack that a little bit. And we'll say const borough name, comma, so what's it called, pop 2020. Let's unpack these so we don't have to write so much code. And we'll say selected borough.properties. Okay, so we're saying borough name and pop 2020 need to come out of selected borough.properties. And then when we build out our template down here, we can just say borough name and pop 2020. So now we click, population of Manhattan is 1,694,263. So I would also probably want to bring in some kind of function or package or whatever to format these numbers to make them a little more human readable. Again, alerts are a terrible way to get this information across, but what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that we can interact with the map a little bit and pull information out from the layers that we've added. So this would be the stepping stone to taking that population data and rendering a chart with it in the sidebar, or it all depends on what you're building, but you want to be able to just take control of, allow your user to click on the map and then react to that click. And a lot of times reacting to that click involves figuring out what they clicked on the map and then pulling data out of it and then doing something with that data. So this is a simplistic example of that. Okay, so just to recap, let's go back to the slides real quick. To recap, yeah, so we learned what GeoJSON is, and we learned we can do points, lines, and polygons with GeoJSON data. You can draw your own GeoJSON data in a tool like geojson.io. You can convert a shapefile into GeoJSON. You can add properties to it so that you have something to use inside of your map environment once you get it into the project. We understood what sources and layers are, and we know that there are lots of sources and layers already on the map as soon as we get it loaded using the Mapbox core styles. But we want to add our own sources and layers using local data from our project. You can actually also pull that data down from anywhere else. If you happen to have a GeoJSON file hosted on GitHub or somewhere else, you can do that. We added data-dependent styling. So we looked at Mapbox expressions, which can be very difficult and complex, but extremely powerful at the same time. So we can do a lot of things to style that data, and we can go into the style spec and figure out all the different ways we can present a layer and a line and that sort of thing. So this is just the very basics, but you can move on from there. And then finally, we used query rendered features to give a little taste of some interactivity where we can sense a click on the map and we can take information from that click and then use it elsewhere in our app. All right, so if I were to finish this up, if I were to make a real app out of this, I'd probably build a nice header and sidebar, and I would take that click information and present something useful in the sidebar. So we'll get into a little more interactivity next week. But for now, let's do some Q&A if there are any questions. So give me just a moment to open up the chat, see if anybody has a question. I don't know if I'll be able to see it while I'm screen sharing, so give me just a moment here. Okay, I'm being told that we don't have any questions at the moment. So with that, I think we will wrap it up. And next week, we're going to get into, oh, wait, we do have somebody raise their hand. So maybe there is a chat. I don't know if I can see the chat. So I have a colleague who may be able to pass this on to me through another channel. So let's see what she says. She can't see it either. Okay. Participant who raised their hand. Let's see if you can ask me a question. I don't see how I can do this. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and see if I can get into this chat window. Okay, so I do see chat, but I don't see a question in there. I'm not sure who raised their hand. So I guess I'm just going to say, yeah, actually, let me share screen again. And we'll get back to this presentation. So sorry, next week, we're going to cover a little bit of interactivity. So we're going to do fly to and fit bound so we can actually animate the map to move to a different location. We're going to look into how to highlight a layer on hover. So it's a little more customization with styles, but we want, a highlight layer that will only show up when the person is hovering or when the user is hovering over a certain other part of the map. We're going to show how to show and hide layers. So lots of other things that, we can add interactivity where the user is interacting with something outside of the map, but you can control the map with that using JavaScript. We're going to add an address search plugin. So Mapbox already has, an entire search API ready to go. And all you need to do is, add a few lines of code to bring in address search. And that can be helpful depending on what kind of app you're building. We're going to take a very quick look at Mapbox Studio, which if if after writing style JSON by hand and adding layers and things like that by hand in code, you may be wishing, oh, I wish there was a GUI for this. Well, there is. It's called Mapbox Studio, and you can actually go in and it's kind of like Illustrator for maps. So that's what we're going to cover next week. And then here are some resources as we wrap up. So for the person who wanted to ask a question, I think we're having some technical difficulties and I can't necessarily see anything in the chat. But we do actually have a developer Discord server, which we are just launching right now, which is a wonderful place for you to ask that question if you want to sign in there. I'm in there most of the time and would be happy to answer your question there. And otherwise, take a look at the documentation. I've also got an awesome list of Mapbox demos here. This is kind of a long URL, but go check it out. It's kind of a curated, it's just a README on GitHub, but every time I see an interesting demo, I put it on there, and I think it's a great place for you to go see all kinds of different approaches and techniques that are possible with Mapbox GL. And then lastly, hit us up on Twitter. You can tag at Mapbox. You can tag me at Chris Wong. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you again next week for part 3. Take care.